My name's Sebastian Major.
Sebastian Major is great.
The Tudors Dynasty podcast.
It's a continent podcast.
The history of American food.
Partial historians.
Tsar Power.
The history of Persia.
Wittenberg to Westphalia.
Curiosity of a Child podcast.
The Siècle.
Pontifex.
Totalis Rankium.
Apparently, everyone.
At Intelligent Speech.
Go to intelligentspeechonline.com to get your tickets.
November 4th.
It'll be a doozy.
Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 31, The Manifesto. Before we get started, I'm excited to announce that I'll be speaking at the Intelligent Speech Conference this year. The conference will be November 4th, and tickets are available at intelligentspeechonline.com. Now, back to the Dukes of Burgundy. While by divine grace we had once held the government of the Kingdom of France, we have since withdrawn ourselves from it. People of low birth and without station have then seized the management of public affairs, with the sole intent of appropriating for themselves, either openly or in secret, the wealth of the realm. And their conduct has been so outrageous that my lord the king, his family and officers were kept in the utmost poverty. They did not pay the usual royal charities, nor did they see to the repairs or maintenance of the various garrisons and defenses, and let them fall into disrepair. For although each year immense sums were raised through taxes and loans, scarcely any part of them were used in public expenditure or for the good of the kingdom. We therefore, having fully considered all these matters, and how closely we are by blood connected with my lord the king, being his cousin, and holding from him the Duchy of Burgundy and the counties of Flanders and Artois, and that we are first peer of the Kingdom of France, and a peer twice over, and that our various and great obligations to him and to his crown are well known, have determined to provide a sufficient remedy for the above evils, and ensure that restitution be made. So begins John the Fearless's Manifesto, issued in the castle of Hesdin, a few weeks after the death of John of Touraine. This document continues in the same passionate and aggressive tone to rail against the injustices done to the Duke of Burgundy, to the King, and to the Kingdom of France. John's manifesto was an incredible piece of propaganda, not only for the heavily revisionist take on the Civil War, but also for the effect it had on the people of France. Because along with railing against the Armagnacs, John also railed against the heavy taxes. Quote, "We shall continue these reforms of grievances that oppress the people, such as gabelles, tithes, and other exactions, and we have determined to pursue those worthwhile aims with all our means." Despite John accusing the king's Armagnac ministers of poisoning the Dauphins, of running the kingdom into the ground, of breaking all the former civil peaces made, of failing to defend France against the English, of oppressing the people, and of unjustly keeping him from power, what really motivated John's followers can be summed up in the last line of the manifesto, quote, "We will also make sure that in the future no taxes or impositions may ever again be levied in France, and we will proceed against all who say or act otherwise with fire or sword." This manifesto, in effect, gave the people of France an excuse to stop paying their taxes. And after over a decade of crushing taxation, which only seemed to rise from year to year, many took that opportunity. John's manifesto did not come out of the blue. It was built upon a long tradition of Burgundian propaganda, and John's desire, either genuine or cynical, for reform of the French governing apparatus. But the vitriol that was contained in the document likely came from John seeing that he no longer had any chance of a peaceful agreement with Paris. With the death of John of Touraine left any hopes of an advantageous settlement for the Duke of Burgundy, and in the weeks after John's death, the moves made by the Armagnacs against the Queen extinguished any hope of a settlement more generally. When John of Touraine died, Isabeau was in the royal castle of Vincennes, where she had been since the Count of Armagnac had put an end to the negotiations between her, William of Bavaria, and John the Fearless about 6 weeks prior. But she was not alone in Vincennes. She had with her her youngest son, Charles of Ponthieu, who all of a sudden now was the Dauphin. Isabeau's plan for the Dauphin did not change due to who was the Dauphin. The queen wanted to repeat Louis of Guienne's work to forge a neutral Dauphinist party in order to reassert royal authority over both the Armagnacs and Burgundians. To this aim, she collected a store of treasure which she had kept from the Count of Armagnac, courted a collection of former and discontented Armagnacs and Burgundians, and had began to gather soldiers at Vincennes. As the queen summoned soldiers to try and muscle the Armagnacs out of power, the Count of Armagnac went to the king to convince him to move against his wife. The Count of Armagnac spun tales about the scandalous behavior of the queen and her courtiers to King Charles. But Bernard's real motivation was the threat that her growing party posed to the Armagnacs. The constable marched on Vincennes with a much larger force than the queen had on hand. There he took control of the Dauphin, scattered Isabeau's supporters, seized her stockpiles of jewels and gold, and sent her to be held at a royal castle in Tours. With Louis of Guienne now long dead and the queen out of the way, the Count of Armagnac worked to dismantle the royal party which Louis and then Isabeau had built. Some of the members he co-opted, while the rest were dismissed. One of those co-opted members was the Breton knight Tanneguy du Chastel. Du Chastel began his career in the service of the Duke of Anjou, before moving to the service of the Duke of Orleans. However, he was not initially a staunch Armagnac, and became a close collaborator with the Duke of Guienne. Tanneguy du Chastel played an important part in the downfall of the Cabotians, the Dauphin's seizure of power in the beginning of 1415, and the Dauphin's regime throughout the year. But when Louis of Guienne died, Tanneguy du Chastel decided to transfer his loyalty to the constable, and ever since had been a committed Armagnac, and he even took part in the constable's arrest of the queen. While some of the members of Louis's old faction ended up joining the Burgundians, the fact that the Count of Armagnac now controlled the Dauphin prompted many more to join the Armagnacs alongside du Chastel. The queen still carried the banner of the royal party, but she had lost many of her supporters. As the queen was unpopular and her court had a reputation for scandalous behavior and lavish spending, many believed the superficial reason for her imprisonment. As for the Duke of Burgundy, while his propaganda likely played into the excuse given for the Count of Armagnac's moves against Isabeau, he must have seen through it. So with the queen no longer a political operator and the Dauphin in the hands of the Armagnacs, John the Fearless decided to go on the offensive. He issued the Manifesto that we began our episode with, and sent it out to towns all around France, with an emphasis on the towns of Picardy, Champagne, and the Ile de France. John's timing was excellent, as his manifesto reached the towns mere weeks after a new tie had been announced. So, just as people were grumbling about new taxes, John the Fearless came around saying that those taxes were illegitimate, and that not paying them would actually help the king. As the manifesto spread, so too did anti-Armagnac and anti-tax sentiment. In many of the towns that received John's letter, the royal officers, who were almost exclusively Armagnac appointees by this point, were either chased out of town or just had their authority ignored. As these Armagnac-aligned royal officials were rejected by the towns, John sent officers of his own to assume that authority. These Burgundian officers reiterated John's manifesto and proclaimed that all royal taxes, with the exception of the gabelle, or salt tax, would be cancelled. This propaganda campaign was matched with a military one. In the weeks after John the Fearless issued his declaration to the good towns of the kingdom, companies of Burgundian soldiers were swarming through Picardy to secure the support of the towns who had not yet gone over to the Burgundian side. However, at this point, the propaganda campaign was putting much more pressure on the constable's government in Paris than the military campaign was. After years of the high nobles of the realm plundering the treasury, civil war, and foreign war, the royal government was broke, and much of the kingdom had been taxed to capacity. Shortly before the Duke of Burgundy issued his manifesto, the Count of Armagnac had received a report that the government needed between 800,000 and 900,000 francs to continue functioning over the next 5 months, and that all sources of ordinary revenues had already been assigned. The government in Paris had resorted to debasing the coinage, or reducing the content of precious metal in each coin, in order to make their limited amount of specie go further, and the people of Paris were now being routinely shaken down for spare change. However, these measures fell short, hence why John's message reached so many towns along with news of a new tax. But as I said earlier, much of the kingdom had already been taxed to capacity, so even the towns that had not thrown out their Armagnac-aligned officials resisted collection, and there was always a pro-Burgundian contingent in these towns willing to take advantage of any unrest. Richard Vaughan wrote, quote, "In almost every French town, Burgundians and Armagnacs were both represented, and the question of whether or not a given town would opt for John the Fearless or for the Armagnacs often resolved itself into a struggle between the two parties inside the city walls." So with the Armagnacs getting desperate and feeling the squeeze, they decided to send soldiers to try and stem the Burgundian tide. But as the Armagnacs were so short on funds, the scope of these counterattacks was quite limited. A defensive line throughout Picardy was established, but the Armagnac government's effective reach had already been significantly shortened. And this shortened reach was not only seen in Picardy. One of the major theaters of conflict between Armagnacs and Burgundians was the Norman city of Rouen. Weeks of conflict between the townsmen allied with the factions only concluded when Dauphin Charles marched an army to the city in person. And this was just as Henry V was preparing to sail to Normandy once again. More on that shortly. But the Constable and the Duke of Burgundy had larger campaigns planned for the summer of 1417. In June, John the Fearless began assembling an army over 10,000 strong from his territories and allies, and managed to secure a massive aid of 300,000 livres from Flanders, by far the largest that had ever been granted to him. Meanwhile, the Constable had been busy following the Burgundian program of reform in a way. Privileges and grants given to the princes were slashed, as were the salaries of many royal officers, and the households of the royal family were shrunk. But along with the cost-cutting measures came steep impositions. As the Armagnac government could really only effectively tax half the kingdom at this point, that half was taxed heavily. Whatever treasure could be found by the government was melted down and turned into debased coins. But money wasn't the only big constraint that the Constable's government was dealing with. There was also an acute manpower shortage. Soldiers were needed in Paris to continue the repression that secured the Armagnac hold on the city. Soldiers were needed in Normandy to contest the latest English invasion. And soldiers were needed to fight the Duke of Burgundy, both in the north and the south. So when John the Fearless began his campaign into Picardy and Champagne in July of 1417, his forces massively outnumbered those that Bernard of Armagnac could muster. And numbers weren't the only advantage that the Duke of Burgundy held. His army also contained the largest and most advanced artillery train seen in France up to that point. With his large army and artillery train, the Duke of Burgundy could often just approach a city and demand its surrender. On the comparatively few occasions when a city would not submit immediately, a few days' worth of bombardment was usually enough to either take the city by force or convince its inhabitants to surrender. By mid-August, John had taken several key cities in Picardy and Champagne, and was using the city of Amiens as his base. While he was preparing for a major thrust into the Ile de France, he received an ambassador from the court, Hubert de Chauny, who you might recall was the initial suspect in the murder of Louis of Orleans. In the king's name, de Chauny ordered John to dismiss his army, return to his own lands, and write to the king to explain why he had raised the army despite a royal order telling him not to. John was not moved by de Chauny's words, and instead said that he had half a mind to order de Chauny beheaded for carrying such a message. Hubert de Chauny then fell to his knees and said that he was constrained to act on the king's orders. John the Fearless replied that he would not dismiss his army, nor would he return to his territories. The Duke of Burgundy granted that he would explain to the king why he had defied his orders, but that this could not be done in writing. Rather, John would come to Paris at the head of his army and explain his reasons to Charles face to face. But despite this dramatic episode, the Duke of Burgundy did end up deciding to put a reply into writing. This letter was quite similar to John's declaration at Hesdin, and reiterated all of the classic Burgundian propaganda lines and revisionist history of the past decade. I won't get into it as much because you've basically heard it all before, but like with most of the other letters and declarations I've quoted, it appears in Enguerrand de Monstrelet's chronicles if you care to read it for yourself. John also made sure that his response was distributed beyond the royal council. This response set off a flurry of Burgundian demonstrations in the streets of Paris and the other towns of France, which were then matched by Armagnac repression. As the Duke of Burgundy was campaigning in the north, the Duchess of Burgundy, Margaret of Bavaria, was overseeing another conquest, this one much closer to home. The royal bailiwick of Mâcon was nested in the southeast corner of the Duchy of Burgundy. The bailiff of Mâcon was in Armagnac, and the city had received a copy of John's Manifesto. A Burgundian agent in the town of Mâcon was able to gather a group of pro-Burgundian citizens, and they took control of the town and declared for the Duke. This was repeated in the other towns of the bailiwick, and soon the region was under the control of Burgundian partisans. Shortly after the initial Burgundian uprising, a group of ducal officials and a small army led by the Chancellor of Burgundy traveled south to secure Mâcon for the Duke of Burgundy. They garrisoned the fortified places of the bailiwick and took over its administration and revenues. Mâcon was virtually annexed into the Duchy of Burgundy, with its administrators taking orders from the ducal council at Dijon and forwarding the bailiwick's taxes and tolls to the Dijon Chambre des Comptes. The move into Mâcon was motivated more by a desire for expansion than strategic needs, as the small bailiwick did not pose a threat to Burgundy. From Mâcon, ducal officials attempted to repeat their success further south into the Lyonnais and the town of Lyon. However, the Armagnacs from Mâcon were able to regroup in Lyon and take advantage of the city's strong royalist leanings to hold off the Burgundian advance. And much to his dismay, John the Fearless never got his hands on the wealthy city. Throughout the next month, the Duke of Burgundy's campaign continued, and he thrust through Picardy, Champagne, and the Ile de France until Paris was surrounded. Burgundian forces soon occupied the suburbs of the city and hoped to lure the Armagnacs into attacking or encourage the people of Paris to rise up. But the Armagnacs did not attack, and the heavy hand with which they controlled Paris was tightened further to prevent a pro-Burgundian uprising. John the Fearless could make no progress on the capital and was beginning to lose the initiative. Throughout October, he had continued to expand his reach south, but now the Armagnac resistance grew stronger, and brief sieges were replaced with protracted sieges. The Duke of Burgundy had already burned through much of the aid voted to him by the Flemings, and saw that if he didn't manage to enter Paris quickly, he would be out of money and then out of options. Ironically, he couldn't even raise much from the vast swaths of France now under his control, as he had based this campaign on opposition to taxation. The only tax being maintained was the gabelle, but even with that and the voluntary contributions from the Burgundian allied towns, John was still running out of money fast. So in late October, John the Fearless entered into secret negotiations with the imprisoned queen. Before long, a conspiracy was launched to free her for the Burgundian cause. For the queen, John the Fearless could secure her freedom, and her freedom of action. For if she accepted the Burgundian line that the king was being manipulated by evil counselors, then she could call on the earlier royal ordinances and claim the powers once granted to her. And for the Duke of Burgundy, if she did that, then he would gain a new font of legitimacy, and they could set up a government to rival Armagnac Paris that could reasonably claim the mantle of the true royal government. So at the beginning of November, John the Fearless sent a company of 800 men to rescue the queen from her imprisonment in Tours, and made arrangements to meet her there. Isabeau had requested to hear mass in an abbey on the outskirts of the city, a request that was granted after some cajoling. The fact that this request was granted, even if it took some effort on the queen's part, and that she was able to organize the coming rescue, does imply that her imprisonment might not have been maximum security, and may have been more of an uncomfortable exile than an actual imprisonment. But regardless, while Isabeau was attending mass, the Burgundian troops arrived, told her that the Duke of Burgundy would be on his way soon, and arrested her jailers. Later that day, the Queen and the Duke of Burgundy made their entrance into Tours, while the Armagnac captain of the city locked himself in the citadel when he couldn't prevent their entrance. Isabeau and John then formalized their alliance and issued a joint proclamation which reiterated the Burgundian position against paying taxes to Armagnac Paris. The two then went to Chartres, where they set up a Burgundian anti-government. A royal council was appointed and staffed with Burgundian partisans and men exiled from Paris by the Count of Armagnac. John benefited almost immediately from the Queen's new powers, as she then granted him a large subsidy from whatever royal revenues were available to her, which, although limited, did give the Duke important access to funds. When the Count of Armagnac's government heard of the Burgundian liberation of the Queen, the Royal Council reaffirmed the Dauphin's appointment as the King's Lieutenant General for all of France, and proclaimed that the Dauphin would wield royal authority when the King was absent, rather than the Queen. But as Isabeau was now taking the position that the King's acts were not his own, but those of the Count of Armagnac and other evil counselors, she just ignored it, and continued to claim her powers. In the Queen's response to the Royal Council, apart from the usual claims against men of low station usurping the power of the crown, she made special mention of how the government failed to protect Normandy from the English. So let's get into that. After the victories at Harfleur and Agincourt in 1415, the English laid low for most of 1416. This was for two main reasons. First, the 1415 campaign had stretched English royal finances to the limit, and some time was needed to secure funds for a follow-up. And second, as we saw last episode, Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Germany, was trying really hard to secure peace between England and France. And if Henry V ignored his entreaties, he would have earned the enmity of both Sigismund and the wider international community, and would have undermined his own propaganda about the justness of his cause. So, as the Count of Armagnac was ignoring Sigismund's peace mission and besieging Harfleur, which thoroughly annoyed the King of Germany, and ended up pushing him towards an alliance with England, Henry V stood by. The King of England eventually realized what was going on and organized a relief effort, and it arrived only just in time. Henry V spent the rest of 1416 preparing for another expedition to Normandy in hopes that he could still capitalize on the gains of 1415. And fortunately for him, the Civil War in France was about to really heat up again. Henry V landed in Normandy on the 1st of August, while the Duke of Burgundy began his grand offensive on August 10th. The concurrence of these campaigns meant that the government in Paris was forced to split their attention and armies to deal with both forces, and in the end they largely chose to oppose the Duke of Burgundy rather than the King of England. When Hubert de Chauny was delivering the Royal Council's message to the Duke of Burgundy, it included an accusation that John had entered into an alliance with the King of England. In his response to the Royal Council, John declared that he had no alliance with England, and he was telling the truth here. But as we explored last episode, it was possible that a degree of strategic cooperation had been established at Calais the previous year. So with most of the central government's attention focused on the Duke of Burgundy, the French defenders of Normandy were largely on their own. The Norman town of Caen had been under siege for about a month, and when they requested aid from Armagnac Paris, they were told that no men or money could be spared. So Caen fell, and after that, many of the other towns and castles in Lower Normandy saw that they could expect no help from Paris in holding out. As Henry V continued his advance through Normandy, many towns decided that resistance would be futile. And as the Armagnac government in Paris was unable to help the Normans, many of those who were still committed to resisting the English decided to recognize the Burgundian anti-government, which was now based in the Champagne town of Troyes. Shortly after John the Fearless and Isabeau of Bavaria arrived in Troyes in January of 1418, the Queen deputized the Duke of Burgundy with her powers of regency. While in Troyes, the Duke and Queen continued to organize their government. They established a new Parlement in opposition to the Paris Parlement, and began organizing financial institutions and other administrative bodies similar to those in Paris, such as a Chambre des Comptes. Just as the Burgundians were organizing their anti-government, the Count of Armagnac was beginning to turn back the tide of the Burgundian advance. In the first weeks of 1418, the Armagnac government was able to break through the Burgundian line to the west of Paris and establish communications and supply lines to the anti-Burgundian territories of Orléans, Anjou, and Maine, as well as push back the Burgundian line northeast of the capital. But while the Armagnacs were pushing back the Burgundians around Paris, they were losing ground to the English in the north. John's accusations that they were simply allowing the English to have Normandy were fairly accurate, and causing significant damage to the Armagnac government's reputation. So as I said earlier, many Norman towns were now turning to the Duke of Burgundy and his government in Troyes for protection. But this was a double-edged sword for John the Fearless. Now, obviously, having more of France recognizing his government was a good thing for its legitimacy, but it also meant that John's rapprochement with the English was in danger of breaking down, and that if a Burgundian-allied Norman town fell to the English, blame would now land on John's doorstep rather than the Count of Armagnac's. So in April of 1418, over 8 months after Henry V's army landed in Normandy, negotiations for a peace deal and joint offensive began between Burgundian and Armagnac representatives in the monastery of La Tombe, with the Duke of Brittany moderating. But the negotiations did not mean that hostilities would be put on hold. In fact, just as the conference was opening, the Count of Armagnac was besieging the Burgundian-held town of Senlis. Senlis had been under siege since the beginning of February, and finally, on the 12th of April, the defenders arranged a conditional surrender. If no relief came within a week, the garrison would hand Senlis over to the constable. As the La Tombe conference opened, both sides had their eyes on the situation at Senlis, and thus both were only willing to offer harsh terms. The Burgundian delegation demanded that all of the Queen's edicts over the past few months be recognized by the King's government, that the Queen gain control over appointments to royal offices, that the Duke of Burgundy be allowed to enter Paris with as many men as he pleased, and that the Duke of Burgundy have free access to the King and the Dauphin. On the other hand, the Armagnac delegates demanded that the Duke of Burgundy surrender all of his military gains and withdraw his garrisons into his territories, that all of the Queen's edicts be annulled, that the Duke of Burgundy publicly disavow any agreement made with the Kings of England and Germany, and that he joins the royal army to face off against the English. On the morning of the 19th of April, the constable demanded the surrender of Senlis. However, the defenders received word that John of Luxembourg, nephew of the late Valoran of Luxembourg, Count of Saint-Pol, was leading an army to relieve the town. The defenders claimed that while it was the appointed day of surrender, the time agreed to had not yet come. The constable, furious at the defiance, killed a handful of hostages in front of the walls of Senlis, and the defenders responded with executions of their own. But even if he was slightly late, John of Luxembourg approached Senlis, and the Count of Armagnac withdrew from the town to meet him in battle. But no battle would occur, and the constable retreated to Paris. When news of the events at Senlis reached La Tombe, the Armagnac delegates decided that they were willing to compromise. Negotiations soon became more productive, and before long, the conference was put on recess so the delegates could meet up with their superiors for further instructions. The conference reopened in early May, and from there, negotiations continued to go smoothly. Part of the reason for this was that, like in the later negotiations in Lollingham back in the 1390s, the most contentious issues were simply ignored. After about 2 weeks of negotiations, a peace agreement was reached, centered around a general amnesty, the return of confiscated property by all parties, and a future conference to be held at Milan. The Duke of Burgundy and the Queen accepted these terms, but the Armagnac Royal Council was divided. Most of the councillors and the Dauphin were in favor of the La Tombe agreement, but the hardliners, such as Tanneguy du Chastel and the constable himself, were opposed to it. And in the end, the La Tombe agreement would never be ratified. As I said last episode, plots to return the city to the Duke of Burgundy would continue throughout the Count of Armagnac's tenure as master of Paris. And while the fight on whether or not to accept the La Tombe agreement was going on in the Royal Council, one of these conspiracies was being organized. Around 2 a.m. on May the 29th, the gatekeepers at the Porte Saint-Germain lowered the drawbridge for a force of a few hundred Burgundian soldiers. The soldiers marched to the center of the city, where they rendezvoused with a large pro-Burgundian mob. From there, the Burgundians spread around the capital, chanting pro-Burgundian slogans, securing key areas, and arresting notable Armagnacs. A collection of the soldiers and ringleaders of the conspiracy went to see the king. When King Charles heard that these men were here to see him on behalf of the Duke of Burgundy, he reportedly asked them how his cousin's health was and why he had not come to see him in so long. By morning, the Burgundians controlled Paris. They did not, however, control the Dauphin. Tanneguy du Chastel was woken up by the noise and the chanting, and thinking quickly, he spirited away the Dauphin to the Bastille, and eventually out of Paris entirely. Richard Famiglietti wrote about it, quote, "Many historians had made Tanneguy a hero for saving the Dauphin on this night. Actually, the provost was saving the Armagnac party." And I agree with this analysis. Dauphin Charles faced no threat of harm from even the most rabidly anti-Armagnac partisans. However, if he was brought into the presence of his mother, John the Fearless, and other important Burgundians, the prince's Armagnac leanings risked being undone. Despite all the chaos of the night, the Burgundian coup was relatively bloodless. It seems that only 2 or 3 people were killed when they shouted, "Long live the Count of Armagnac," in front of a group of Burgundian soldiers. Now, I don't personally think that this deserved a death sentence, but I'm not sure what they expected. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, the remaining Armagnacs schemed to regain control of the capital. A few hundred men joined up with the garrison at the Bastille, while Tanneguy du Chastel captured one of the gates of the city with another few hundred. The 2 Armagnac armies began their march into the city, but were met with barricades manned by Parisians, and Burgundian soldiers dug in with guns. The Armagnac armies were easily pushed out of Paris, and those that did not die in the attempt on the city decided to pull out of the Ile de France. But unfortunately for the Armagnacs remaining in Paris, the failed counterattack set off a rash of paranoia. A few days after the retreat, rumors began to spread through the city that another army was on its way. And furthermore, tales were being told that the first Armagnac attempt to retake the city had included massacres of the inhabitants and a plan to sack Paris. A mob gathered, and as the rumors continued to swirl, the paranoia became self-reinforcing. With their blood now boiling, rabble-rousers took the lead, and soon the mob was out for blood. Many of the high-ranking Armagnac prisoners were being held in the Palais de la Cité, and that was the first target of the paranoid and vengeful Parisians. The mob swept through the Conciergerie, the prison of the Cité, with clubs, knives, and axes. The Count of Armagnac was dragged into the courtyard and beaten to death, along with several members of his administration. But the end of the Count of Armagnac did not put an end to the riot. The crowd then made their way to other prisons throughout the city. When all was said and done, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 lay dead, many of them merely common criminals or debt prisoners. The air of paranoia, the fear of invasion, and the massacres of the prisoners really remind me of the September massacres during the French Revolution. And the damage done to the reputations of the National Convention and the Burgundians also mirror each other. Neither had been directly responsible for the massacres, but both had contributed to the air of paranoia that spawned them. The Armagnac attack on Paris and pro-Burgundian reprisals put an end to the negotiations between the parties. The Burgundian seizure of Paris had come at a time where domestic peace seemed possible. But scarcely 2 weeks later, the fear and loathing between the two parties was as high as it had ever been. The Dauphin was now the leader of the Armagnac faction, and surrounded by men who would fight to the death against the Duke of Burgundy. Queen Isabeau's goal at the beginning of the episode had been to create a neutral royalist or Dauphinist party, and while the Dauphin was now in charge, at least nominally, of a party, this was not that. Now, the royal family would be divided against itself, with the king and queen acting as Burgundians and the Dauphin as an Armagnac. John the Fearless and Queen Isabeau finally returned to Paris on July the 14th, and the Duke of Burgundy now seized control of the king's royal government. But France was split in 3. The Dauphin had fled to Bourges in the Duchy of Berry, where he argued that his parents were mere puppets of the Duke of Burgundy, and thus claimed royal authority for himself, much like John and the Queen had done in Troyes. Meanwhile, Henry V had conquered a sizable chunk of northern France and showed no signs of stopping. John the Fearless now controlled Paris, but he did not control the whole of France. And next time, we'll see all 3 men jockeying for control of the kingdom come together in battle and diplomacy, and only 2 will make it out of that episode alive. Thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Comte de Chenonceau; Elliot, Graf von Gravenstein; Anthony, Comte de Châteauneuf-en-Auxois; James, Graf von Temse; Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau; Mark, Comte de Meursault; Diana, Graf von Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Seymour, David, Graf von Bornum, Rosa, Comte de Germont, and Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Quentin, Graf von Blossfeld, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois Burgundy on Twitter or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.